All right, so I'm just going to briefly go over the main points of the case studies from this chapter. So the first one that you read about was the Inuit Health in a Changing Arctic by Johnson. And this case study kind of really shows how Inuits view environmental changes not only as climate change, but in the context of a longer history of social change that didn't take Indigenous perspectives into account, and that scientific and Indigenous knowledge can be at odds with each other or in disagreement with each other. The interesting thing about this is we kind of, I think the dominant narrative is usually that, Native folks are really in touch with nature, and so they're really sensing the changes in the climate, and they would be on board with the fact that it is climate change, not just weather patterns. And so this sort of takes a departure from that to say that the the Inuit relationship between the community and the environment has been threatened for a long time by all these different things, including colonialism, like settler colonialism, and um, a history of social change that didn't take their perspective into account. And so it's interesting to think about it from this perspective as well, because we usually think of Native communities as being on board with the sort of left idea about climate change. So the second one is Raffatetta's environmental pollution and allergies one, and this is a really fascinating case study that looks at the embodied experience of people with allergies in Italy and how their claims are not taken seriously, and in fact, many of them who claim to have allergies are instead given sort of psychological treatment because they think that their issues are psychological. And the author really kind of makes the argument that, even if some of their responses to these environmental human interactions are rooted in both physical and psychological impacts, that's a legitimate response to these complex set of interactions that entail human environmental interactions. I think one of the most fascinating examples from there in that case study is that that person that she's working with who's allergic to all sorts of things, and she got over them using these different strategies, that like mindfulness and breaking off the relationship with her mother and that sort of thing. But then her sister had died when she was younger from like riding her scooter out of the way of a cat, and she's allergic to cats. And when the author suggests that, has she ever thought about that as a connection? And then she is able to cure herself of her cat allergy when she recognizes the cause of the allergy was her sort of psychological trauma over her sister's death. So that's a pretty fascinating, and but she was having these physiological responses like an allergy, and so it just really shows the complexity of human environmental interactions through this lens of allergies. The third one is the McMahon reading the environment, and this is the one that really emphasizes the layers of vulnerability in the impact of oil production on the Gulf Coast. So it has environmental, social, climate, economy, racial, socioeconomic, etc., all these different layers of vulnerability. And that's how most sort of environmental human interactions need to be viewed. And of course, lots of discourse in anthropology and outside of anthropology looks at marginalized populations, um, and like small island nations and indigenous folks who are more, or poor people who are more impacted by climate change. And of course, that's something I'm sure you've heard people talk about. McMahon points out that the paradox is that the things that are putting people at risk, like they're putting their health at risk, putting their houses at risk, and their communities, are the same things that led them to be there in the first place. And in this case, it's oil. People have relied on oil, and that's how they've made their living. And now that's what's causing these different um, things to put their health and their houses and that sort of thing at risk. And this case study sort of asks us to compare how we manage environmental risks and chronic health. It's sort of making the connection that when we have chronic health diseases, we usually respond to crises like a heart attack, rather than address the root cause of the crisis. Not always. People do also, address the root causes of their heart attack, like unhealthy lifestyles or whatever it is, but not always. And then the final one is from Adams, The Disastrous Recovery, um, about the post-Katrina New Orleans. And this is a really interesting one as well. And she looks at how the safety net shifted to the private sector. You know, she gives that case study of that old couple where the husband was a Purple Heart and the wife was their house was destroyed, and they tried all these different ways to get their house to get help to get their house repaired. And of course, they didn't have a deed to their home because they had bought it on these predatory lending schemes that were common in the 60s and 70s for Black families in the United States because of redlining. And so, in the end, after her husband has a stroke because of the stress from this situation, after years of living in a trailer on their property, volunteers came in and rebuilt their homes, sort of pooled their money and pooled their skills and rebuilt their home. And Adams is arguing that this isn't just an accident that volunteers fill in roles where civil society fails, but that it's actually by design, and and the benefits to the community from the volunteers is is great, but it's used as a way to justify the lack of aid. So these people don't need aid because the community has come together to help them. And in fact, this mimics what people critique a lot of humanitarian aid around the world, for example, that governments know that humanitarian aid will come in and solve this problem, so they don't have to put systems in place to do that. So some of the people who are very critical of humanitarian aid are for that reason. And then this is just a totally optional one, but last year or maybe 2 years ago, I believe, ETL, Extending the Link, made the film Luen High, and it's about electronic waste, and it's really, really interesting. So I highly recommend watching it. I'm going to put the link on Canvas to that as well. And that one you don't have to watch, but I recommend it as well. All right. Thanks.